So today I'm going to give you a quick little seminar on how Plutarch's Life of Alexander used the Greek ideas of horsemanship in a way of balancing Alexander the Great's character, particularly when he does something that doesn't quite align with how an aristocratic king should behave. To do this, I'm going to use the Dreamworks classic Shrek to help convey a few of the more unusual ideas. So for those of you who are new to this material, Alexander the Great was a Macedonian king from the mid-4th century BCE who conquered lands as far as India. Shrek, on the other hand, was an ogre from the year 2001 who conquered everyone's hearts. So here's a quick rundown of what to expect from today's lecture. First, I'll give a bit of background on Plutarch and other source material that may be useful for studying Alexander's actions, followed by a bit of a background on Alexander himself. After that, I'll talk about Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, before finally moving on to the Greek ideas of horsemanship, where our knowledge of Shrek will come in handy. So who was Plutarch? Plutarch was a Boeotian Greek from the 1st and 2nd century CE. This was a good few hundred years after Alexander's campaigns, meaning Plutarch would have had to rely on other sources from closer to the time of Alexander's reign for his information. Now, Plutarch wrote a series of biographies known as parallel lives, where he tried to line up prominent Greek and Roman individuals based on their characteristics. Due to the distance between Alexander's campaign and Plutarch's writing, we're automatically confronted with issues of historical accuracy. I'm sure you can all imagine the various strengths and weaknesses of contemporary source material. On top of this, Plutarch's writing, being biographical, is subject to getting quite a bit caught up in the story. In other words, Plutarch loves a good gossip. So while this is problematic from a purely historical perspective, it can actually be really informative about Greek ideas and values in antiquity. Fortunately for us, the idea of horsemanship is one of the subtle themes trotting along within the text. In fact, I'm going to argue that the way Plutarch presents his narrative is instrumental in bringing out the ideas of Greek horsemanship that put the spotlight on Bucephalus. The way that Plutarch does this is by making strong allusions to another ancient writer, Plato. Plato was a philosopher and had a way of using animalistic imagery to represent and convey cultural ideas. Plutarch uses this throughout his work, with other examples of horsemanship appearing in the life of Themistocles and life of Mark Antony. Another source that you're going to have to be aware of for today's lecture is Arrian. He's a lot more cut and dry than Plutarch, preferring to focus on the more realistic aspects of Alexander's campaign. So before we start, I think it's important to get a bit of an idea of who Alexander the Great is and what he did to earn his reputation. Alexander was a Macedonian king. He was born in 356 BCE, ascended to power in 336 BCE, and died whilst on campaign in 323 BCE. His campaign spanned from Greece right the way through Persia and deep into, not so deep, into India, sorry. As you'd expect from someone who had a successful military career, as a king, Alexander has a pretty good reputation, having been heralded and mythologized after his death. Despite this, he did some pretty crazy stuff, and it's no wonder he earned such a great reputation as a leader and general. A few of his personal achievements include being in the thick of it for pretty much all of his main battles, leading from the front and taking charge of the phalanx cavalry that would lead the attack on the opposition. He also liked to do all sorts of crazy stuff, pretty much just to show that he could. An example of this was his siege on the supposedly impenetrable Sogdian Rock, taking it by climbing to the steepest part of the wall with the assistance of tent pegs and a select group of soldiers. Now, if any of you think this sounds a little familiar, it's probably because you've seen it before on Game of Thrones with Jon Snow and the wildlings climbing the wall. Whether or not the wall was as steep and treacherous as the one presented in Westeros, I think it's probably quite debatable, but either way, it was pretty impressive feat undertaken by the king. So it's no wonder Alexander is called Alexander the Great. Now, Bucephalus was kind of a big deal. He survived for a long time through the campaigns, when the Macedonians were really struggling. There were even times when they had to eat their horses, but fortunately, Bucephalus didn't make the chop. The horse is even begrudgingly referenced by that other really important source called Arrian, purely because he thought it was respectful towards Alexander, stating, "Let so much honour be paid by me to this Bucephalus for the sake of his master." Now, for context, this was really not what Arrian was interested in. In fact, Arrian went out of his way not to include many of the more romantic stories and aspects of Alexander's campaign, instead opting for a more military-focused historical approach. So for Arrian to say something like this shows that the horse was a big deal, especially for its master. So, depending on who you ask, Bucephalus was a Thessalian horse. Or it was a Cappadocian horse, or it was a cross between a horse and a griffin, or maybe it was a cross between an elephant and a dromedary. But for the sake of today's lecture, I think we're just going to run on the assumption that it was a Thessalian horse. I didn't do that. I'm not that tech savvy. Now, this in itself is pretty insightful into the calibre of the horse. Thessalian breeds have a pretty strong reputation in antiquity, with Thessalian cavalry being highly respected in military ranks. So Bucephalus was a horse, but interestingly its name means ox head. It might not surprise you to know that there was a reason for this name, and it wasn't just in vogue at the time. Arrian gives two reasons for the horse being named ox head. The first is that it had been branded on the buttocks with an ox head as a distinguishing mark. His second reason suggests that Bucephalus naturally bore a resemblance to the head of a bull. The first suggestion, that the horse was branded with the symbol of an ox head, is the most likely option here, being supported by other sources, including the remains of horse lists, which indicate that there was a universal branding mark, as well as Pliny the Elder. The Bucephalus brand was one of three prominent brand symbols in Greece, so you'll find many horses named similarly. Just think of them as the Allens, Smiths and Browns of their generation. So Bucephalus was the name for a large group of horses based on their breeding and branding patterns, as opposed to a personalised name given specifically to Alexander's horse based on its natural features. Despite Oxhead being nothing more than just a brand, it's not uncommon to see what we regard as bull-like features emphasised in source material. For example, if you have a look here at the Alexander mosaic found in Pompeii, so just at the bottom left there, you can see that just where the ear should be, there's a short and white coloured little horn-like thing. So this is an example of bull-like imagery which suggests to modern scholars that this horse might be Bucephalus. Now, again, we see horns on the head of a horse for the coins up the top, which are minted by the Seleucid dynasty following Alexander's reign. Now, this is a different format, but we can still see the bull-like imagery coming through. So while I think we can all agree that Bucephalus wasn't actually a weird bull-horse hybrid, the reality is that a horse provided for a young noble would undoubtedly be of good stock. It isn't surprising if it did in fact have the powerful qualities that were reminiscent of an elephant or a bull. So how does this relate to Shrek then? Well, to understand that, we're actually going to have to look at another character in the Shrek series, Donkey. Now, at a glance, Donkey and Bucephalus don't share many similarities. The character Donkey in itself is an immediate subversion of the traditional ideas of noble steeds that we've just spoken about. Donkeys in ancient Greece were linked to the lower classes and bore completely different connotations from their equine cousins, horses, who enjoyed the much more fast-paced aristocratic activities such as war and hunting. Another seemingly irreconcilable difference is that Bucephalus couldn't talk, and if he could, he probably wouldn't sound like Eddie Murphy. But, as Princess Fiona aptly points out, Donkey, like Bucephalus, is a noble steed. So what is a steed then? Well, from a functional purpose, you could probably say something like a horse or equine that is being ridden or is available for riding. But within Plutarch's narrative and the movie Shrek, they play a much more important role in forming our understanding of the central character. So what does donkey tell us about Shrek then? Well, as I mentioned, donkeys do not share the same aristocratic connotations that horses do. So by having one as a noble steed, the trope is immediately subverted. This subversion then reflects back on the ogre, who, contrary to the stereotypical ogre tropes of being hideous and horrible, is actually a top guy. The relationship between Alexander and Bucephalus is similar in that regard, but reversed. As opposed to subverting the tropes in the way that Shrek does, the relationship between king and horse strictly adheres to the conventional way of thinking, presenting Alexander as a fantastic horseman and drawing on all the connotations presented with that. As such, Bucephalus, being a powerful and exceptional horse, shows that Alexander is a powerful and exceptional guy who is worthy of being liked and worthy of being king. So with this in mind, I'd like to draw your attention to a specific conversation in the movie Shrek. It's a conversation between Shrek and Donkey regarding onions, cake, and a little bit of parfait. Here we see Shrek, the central character of the narrative, and his noble steed Donkey having a conversation. Now, peeling away from the immediate comedic value of this conversation, Now, peeling away from the immediate comedic value of this conversation, I'd like to draw your attention to the underlying intent by the writers. The conversation creates depth for the character of Shrek, influencing the audience's perspective and understanding of his personality and character. What's more is this discussion is positioned relatively early in the movie, as the two characters are just getting to know each other. What this does is announce to the audience that this character is not just your everyday one-dimensional guy. He's an ogre, and ogres, like onions, have layers. So knowing this, we as an audience go into the movie aware that we need to watch out for these layers, because they will be a recurring theme throughout. There's a reason this conversation was emphasised by the writers, and probably more influentially, a reason why it has been reborn as the subject of memes 15 years later. Now, Bucephalus first appears in chapter 6 of Plutarch's Life of Alexander. In the story, Plutarch describes the rejection of the horse by Philip, the king of Macedon and Alexander's father, as it was deemed to be too wild to be tamed. Before the horse was removed, however, a young Alexander leapt up and challenged his father to let him attempt to ride the horse. If he were to fail, he declared he would pay for the horse himself. Plutarch states that Alexander, upon noting the horse's fear of its own shadow, guided the horse to face the sun whilst stroking it. Having done so, the horse settled and the boy was able to mount it, resulting in the nervous crowd erupting in cheers and his father to make the statement that Macedon was too small for Alexander, hinting that the boy was destined for far greater things. Now, I could talk to you for a while about whether or not this story lines up with what we know about the Greeks, about how the Greeks tamed horses and the types of horses that made for the best in battle, but long story short, it seems to have been exaggerated to emphasise certain traits of the horse. But as you'd expect in a book called The Life of Alexander, much in the way that you'd expect from a movie called Shrek, the character of Bucephalus isn't really that important. What's more important is the relationship between Bucephalus and the young Alexander. The taming of Bucephalus acts as a character-developing tale for Alexander. It emphasises key traits of the young king that would develop, bringing out his physicality, bravery, and above all, intelligence. Furthermore, the story sets the scene for Alexander's future actions and the mythology surrounding them. In doing so, it acts as both a symbolic device within the story and, on a more functional level, a prominent literary device for Plutarch. So like the onion conversation between Shrek and Donkey, this passage is designed to give us readers an indication of the central character's temperament. Additionally, it shares many of the same structural values as the onion conversation. For starters, like I said before, it's been it's positioned early in the narrative. This means that, meaning that it played a similar role for the horse story. The layers of the onion in this case are shown by the act of horsemanship, with the reader being encouraged to watch out for these layers over the rest of the narrative. Horsemanship in ancient Greece was associated with the idea of self-control and restraint. If that seems strange to you, as it did to me 6 months ago, then this is going to require a little bit of self-awareness. From a modern perspective, we see horse lovers and riders in a range of different lights. There's the kids who are strangely obsessed with horses during their early stages of primary school. There's those who are show jumpers who are really impressive when the Olympics rolls around every 4 years or so. There's the police horse riders who strike fear down the late-night alleys of Northbridge. We even see horses as being lumped together with all the ordinary farm animals when we're on our trips down south. The ancient Greek idea of horsemanship, however, is much more uniformly associated with aristocratic ideals. Highly regarded for their power and robustness, the symbolic value of a horse was substantial, which by extension reflected greatly on the rider of such horse. The works of Plato that Plutarch loves so dearly are a great example of this, emphasizing Socratic values with metaphors linked to horsemanship and self-care. The Apologies of Socrates by Plato covers the speech in defense of Socrates whilst on charge for impiety and corruption in Athens in 399 BCE. In this passage, Socrates likens himself to a gadfly stinging the lethargic horse of Athens into action with his keen critiques. To conclude this section, as all good debaters do, Socrates declares that he is a kind of gift from God that is for the betterment of the city. Through the symbolic nature of Plato's works, the idea is established that good horsemen care for others by training them for their own good, much in the way that Socrates was doing for the Athenians. Alexander demonstrates this on a physical level, guiding Bucephalus into the sun and using his hand to calm the horse. What seems like a simple action can be extrapolated further to Alexander as a leader. Plato's symbolism further links to the notion of horses with the idea of human self-care. Horses are seen as being born wild but tamed by nature, much like humans. Children are wild until they are tamed with an education. This seems particularly pertinent with Alexander, being born with an inclination to wild activities such as violence and drinking. But he still demonstrated self-restraint, according to Plutarch, at least. Furthermore, Alexander is still a child when he demonstrates these qualities. In taming the horse, he demonstrates an element of care and control that exceeds those watching, including his father, the king, Philip. This whole idea may seem strange, so I'd like to bring it to a modern context for us. The ancient ideas of horsemanship that I've mentioned actually apply more coherently to the modern connotations of your everyday driver. When you jump in a car with someone, there are always a few things that you consciously or otherwise want from them. The best drivers are calm and composed. You don't want them to be in your car. You don't want to be in the car with a hot-headed driver who's going to go around tearing up the streets. You don't want your driver to be drunk. And ideally, you want someone who knows how to drive. Now, the reasons for this are pretty obvious. You don't want to crash and get seriously injured. You don't want anyone else to get injured. You don't want to get caught. Now, all of this stems from the same idea. You want someone who is going to be able to control themselves so that they can control the car in a way that will avoid any of these things happening. So think of a horse rider in the context of your everyday driver who needs to be in control, and this should make a little bit more sense. So as I've mentioned before, the narrative was in chapter 6 of Plutarch, really close to the start. While we may see it as a neat standalone narrative highlighting Alexander's future greatness, it takes on new dimensions as we look at the material surrounding it, bearing in mind the Greek ideas of horsemanship. The story one book prior in chapter 5 tells us of another great act in Alexander's childhood, where he showed great hospitality to Persian envoys during the absence of his father. This, like Bucephalus's taming, foreshadows Alexander's greatness and brings out other ideas, such as the competitive nature between Alexander and his father Philip. It is chapter 4, however, that we take particular interest in, where Alexander's character is briefly examined by Plutarch. Here Plutarch begins by giving us a brief description of Alexander's appearance, giving us cutting insight by telling us information such as that a very pleasant odour exhaled from his skin. Another slightly more relevant insight that he gives us is, but while he was still a boy, his self-restraint showed itself in the fact that, although he was impetuous and violent in other matters, the pleasures of the body had little hold on him, and he indulged in them with great moderation, while his ambition kept his spirit serious and lofty in advance of his years. What Plutarch is trying to tell us here is that Alexander had a fiery temperament and a hot body. And for this reason, it makes sense that he was a raging alcoholic. So here, we see the idea of self-restraint emerge. Plutarch's telling us two different things here. As a boy, Alexander showed great restraint. I mean, just look at how good he is with horses. So that's nice. That's what a good aristocratic king and leader should be doing. He showed great self-restraint. He didn't indulge himself. He never gave in to pleasure. Fantastic. What a great guy. But then, Plutarch's like, also, by the way, he's a raging alcoholic and can be super violent. Right. So what do we make of this? Plutarch's telling us completely different things at the start of his narrative. So what are we going to believe? Well, the answer to that, I'd suggest, is we're going to believe what is shown to us. And that's where the taming narrative comes in. Plutarch tells us, so Alexander is pretty much perfect. He's got a few minor, serious flaws, but other than that, he's perfect, I swear. Then goes on to demonstrate Alexander's perfection and skills of self-control with this narrative. Again, we have to look at this from a Greek perspective as opposed to our own perspective, as just like with Plato's Apology, the Greeks would have drawn these connotations, or would have likely drawn these connotations from the narrative. Now, I'm not going to comment on who's a better person, Alexander or Shrek. I'm not going to talk about how it's all been downhill since Shrek 2. I'm not even going to mention that the Shrek franchise has descended into exactly the type of movie that it was originally designed to parody. What I am going to say, however, is that the original Shrek was a masterpiece, and by cleverly subverting the tropes, it sent a message that resonated widely among a broad audience. So these two characters, thanks to their relationships with their noble steeds and the manner in which they are presented, are able to provide greater depth to their personality in a way that supports the writer's agenda. For Shrek, this means that we see a grumpy ogre transformed over the course of the movie into a lovable ogre. For Alexander, it means we see the more positive attributes of an unpredictable, violent alcoholic. So while they're different characters with different strengths and weaknesses, Plutarch's representation of Alexander and his horse Bucephalus demonstrates that Alexander is the full onion. So thanks everyone for coming. It's fantastic to see you all here. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have a more specific classics related seminar where we're going to go through the units and go through study tips and that sort of thing, which will hopefully help classics students in the future. These seminars will be running every 2 weeks, and we've got some other fantastic speakers who are going to be talking about all sorts of crazy stuff. So have a look on Facebook. We'll keep you posted. We'll be sending emails around, and if you want to come down and say hi, I'd love to hear from you. So thanks.